My name is Maya Sen. I'm an associate professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm the co-author of Deep Roots: How Slavery Still Shapes Southern Politics.
My name is Matt Blackwell. I'm an assistant professor of government here at Harvard University, and I'm a co-author of Deep Roots: How Slavery Still Shapes Southern Politics.
I think the three of us knew that we were really onto something when one of the first things we did was we work with data sets, and so we pulled down a data set of slavery in 1860, and we paired that with a data set that was about contemporary political attitudes today, right? So data that were basically over 150 years apart. And what we saw in that first analysis that we did was that the prevalence of slavery in 1860 actually predicted attitudes today. Once we saw this very simple relationship, we knew that there was more to the story that we had to explore. So it started off with a very simple finding.
Yeah, and I think when we were thinking about, what does political science look like? What does political science study right now? And how do they explain political attitudes in America and beyond? A lot of times what people are thinking about is, contemporaneous things that are happening right now. So, what is the effect of some mailer that someone gets in the mail or some phone call that they get on whether or not they turn out to vote?
Or what's the effect of James Comey's letter?
Right. These kind of very contemporaneous, very of the moment, maybe some very fleeting things that happen in politics. And we thought that those are all really important components, but they've been shown to have pretty small effects on people's actual behavior. And so we thought there must be something that's driving some of the deep divisions in America, both between regions and within regions. And we thought, what is the biggest kind of force in American history that could have shaped these things? And slavery was one that just immediately jumped to mind. The Black Belt is a fascinating part of the South. It's kind of a hook-shaped region that cuts from the Atlantic coast all the way down to the Mississippi Delta. And it's a place, it's called the Black Belt because of the color of the soil in that area is so dark and rich and suitable for growing cotton and other kinds of crops. And it was really where the part of the South where the plantation economy really took hold the most. And so it's the part of the South that we see the highest density of slavery and enslaved people in the antebellum period.
Yeah, and one thing that's actually really interesting about the Southern Black Belt, and we still use that term today, even though obviously we don't have slavery anymore in the 21st century. But one thing that's very interesting about it is that this is actually part of the country where a lot of African Americans still live, which is an interesting point that I think sometimes gets lost in the conversation about rural versus urban voters. The South has a remarkably large population of African Americans living in rural regions, and a lot of them continue to live in the Southern Black Belt. A really interesting fact when we present this work that I think surprises people is the fact that Barack Obama actually won a large number of counties in the Black Belt, and as did Hillary Clinton, I think maybe less so. The reason why is because these are parts of the South where many African Americans continue to live today. So the legacy of slavery is not just political, it's not just economic, but it's actually also demographic in the sense that there is a large population of people here living in these parts of the country that would not be here for the slave history of these areas.
What we find in this book really is a basic relationship, which is that we find that the political attitudes among white Southerners in areas that used to have slavery are more conservative than whites who live in areas now that had low levels of slavery. And so basically what we're showing through that, and we go through a variety of kind of somewhat complicated statistical tests to show that this seems to be a lasting causal effect of slavery on attitudes of whites in the South. And so in particular that whites that lived in the high slave areas tend to be more conservative now than the whites that live in the low slave areas. And so when we found that, we were really puzzled as to think about, well, how could it be the case that this institution that is now long gone, it's been gone for over 150 years, how could it still have an impact on attitudes today? And really the book was really about kind of trying to trace that relationship out from 1860 or 1863 all the way to the 21st century.
Yeah, and I just want to also point out that I think looking at this with the benefit of 21st century hindsight, I think we tend to think that slavery collapsed overnight and that it was kind of over and done with relatively quickly. And everything that historians have written about this area of the country and about this point in history suggests that it was not that way at all. Slaves were emancipated in 1863, but that bled over into Reconstruction through the 1870s, and then that bled over into Southern Redemption and then into the early parts of Jim Crow. So racial suppression did not end with the Emancipation Proclamation, and in fact continued, but it continued in different ways. So the way that we think about this in the book is that it went from racial suppression and sort of this racial hierarchy went from something that was state sanctioned and had the full force of the federal government and state governments in the form of slavery, to something that actually had to be more informally and kind of socially supported. So it went from slavery to black codes and Jim Crow, racial segregation, educational segregation, and something that's actually very important and very tragic was the pervasive use of racial violence through this time period, basically leading up to the 1930s and 1940s. Yeah. So we think of slavery sort of collapsing in this very clean, neat moment sometimes, but it actually really had sort of huge downstream consequences for a lot of kind of late 19th century and early 20th century history. So the theory of racial threat is an important concept that's been developed by sociologists and political scientists. And essentially what it says is that as shares of the minority population go up, also the threat experienced by the dominant group will also go up. So they'll feel politically threatened, economically threatened, and they'll respond to this racial threat by kind of lashing out in terms of policy positions that are not favorable to the minority group, in terms of the development of racist attitudes and racial hostility. And that theory actually could be a very persuasive explanation for some of the patterns we find, in part because the Black Belt continues to be a place where many, many African Americans live today.
Right. So when we first started working on this project, we had a first finding about, okay, white people in the Black Belt are more conservative now than white people outside the Black Belt. Our first thought was, well, maybe this is just racial threat. Maybe this is just they're responding to what's going on today.
Yeah, that was what a lot of people thought,
right.
I think,
and
when
so,
we presented this.
Right. When we thought, okay, well, this demographic persistence is the story. So we've thought a lot about trying to suss out whether or not this is due to this demographic persistence or really this is just persistence of political attitudes. And actually what we find is that the racial threat seems to actually be, at least in the American South, seems just to be something that is actually driven mostly by slavery. Once you account for the history of slavery in the South, there doesn't appear to be any racial threat at all. So in fact, what we were worried about is that racial threat would explain our findings, but what we ended up finding was more the opposite, actually, that slavery actually helps us to explain and understand racial threat in the South. And what we thought was people experiencing threat from a minority group actually seems to be just kind of deep-seated political culture being driven by things long in the past. And I think that also kind of helps to give us a little bit of humility about some of our contemporary theories of political attitudes. And so I think one big takeaway from the book is that, okay, we need to not be so narrow as to think that everything that's, every reaction, every political attitude, everything that's going on in a particular time is being driven by the stuff right now.
Yeah.
It's very easy to do that, but then you have to stop and think, well, okay, the history of this stuff, where we've been before is also really important.